Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 6, and in this lesson, we're going to be covering another mini project. And this mini project is going to go over extension methods and also the method overloading. So let's dive right into Visual Studio and create a new project. We'll make it a console app in the .NET framework. And we'll call this the extension method mini. Well, let's call it extension methods. And then we'll call this extension methods mini app. Sounds about good. We'll create this and then we'll add console read line at the end. Now, let's do a little bit of setup for this application. We've worked with the console quite a bit, and so we've gotten familiar with the patterns. Now, recently, we haven't actually been running the console just because we don't need to actually run it in order to see the code. But in this case, we're actually going to run it. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an object that we're, again, very familiar with. We've done this over and over again, and that's the person model class. So public class person model. And it's got a few properties in it. A first name, a last name. We're going to have an age, which typically we wouldn't have an age because that's a point in time number. And that always changes because today you might be 25, tomorrow you might be 26. But we're going to have this as a number for now because we wanted to have some kind of value. I wanted to have some kind of value like this, an age, and I'm also going to have copy and paste this and just change it to last name and change this to last name. We can paste it again and we can say, what is your age? But this one's a little trickier because we can't just say age here because that's a string. We could do an int.parse like so. But the problem there is that they give us a number or a value that's not a number. If they hit enter without putting a value in, or if they type TEN, whatever the case may be, if it's not a whole number, it's going to blow up at this point. It's going to throw an exception. We could do a try parse, but then you have to create a whole bunch of code around that. And then what happens if they do give us a bad number? We really want to loop through and ask again, say that's an invalid age, try again, or just ask it again. them by type. So I might have string helpers, I might have int helpers, and I have double helpers. Or I might have, in this case, console helpers, all the things around the console. So it all depends on your situation. Also note that this console helper really very clearly indicates these things work with the console, which means I wouldn't put it in a class library with just regular code. It would be a UI specific class library. Typically, we don't put UI stuff in a class library, but we do if we have things like this. We just don't mix the class libraries. So we can have more than one. In this case, I'd probably have two. I'd have my regular class library with all my standard things, and then I'd have my UI class library that's console UI class library, and that would be for the console specific helpers. So let's create a public static string get, let's say request string. We'll keep it really generic. Oops. This string message. So we're going to request a string. We've said this, which means it's an extension method, and it's going to extend on a string. Therefore, that's going to come in through message. So that message is going to be this right here. So we can follow this pattern. Let's copy this and paste in here and say message is what we're going to write. And then we're going to output this. But let's do this. Let's say string output equals empty string. And this becomes output. Because then remember I said that it wouldn't be a great thing if this was an empty string. So if string.is null or white space on our output, then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through. And actually, it's probably not an if. We should probably say while. I can move this into it. So it starts off with an empty string. So is null or white space is going to say, yeah, it's true. Therefore, loop into here. It's going to write out the message we pass in, and it's going to read the value into output. If it's still null or white space, it's going to loop through again. But once we're done, we can return output. And now we have our first helper. We can simplify this code. So we can take just this right here. We can cut it out. We can remove this. We can remove this line entirely and just say person.firstname equals, put a string, dot. Notice I didn't need to put in a variable. If I had a variable, it would work too, but I don't need to put in a variable in order to do this. And say request string. So that's the message, and I say request string. And so it's going to put that string into first name. I can do the exact same thing then with this. I can cut this out. I can delete that line. I can delete this. I can say request string. And now this is what gets passed in, and it requests it, and it gets back the value. And it's always going to be an actual value, not a null or empty. Now, an integer try parse on our console read line. We're going to say out int, and we can say output here. We don't need to do this. Well, we do. We going to say output. And the reason why we do is because I actually want to put this into a loop. So let's capture the value of this and say bool is valid int equals false. And then we'll capture that value from the try parse. We're going to wrap this whole thing in a while is valid int equals false. So it's gonna say, okay, if the valid int is false, maybe we don't have a valid int yet, then we're going to, that's always the case the first time. Then we're gonna say print the message out, and then grab the resulting value that you type in, try to parse that, and we're gonna out to the output. Meaning we're gonna send the value that we get back, the parsed value, to output. Now that could be a 0 if it's valid or if it's invalid. And that's kind of a tricky bit here. Because if it's valid, then it's the correct value. I mean, we want to actually exit this loop. But if it's 0 because it's invalid, we want to keep going. Therefore, we capture the try parse's output, which is a Boolean, and put that into is valid int. It's only true when it's a valid integer. So that's going to loop through, and now what we can do is we can return output. Now we can have a similar thing here. We can cut this out. We can paste in here and say request int, like so. And now it looks just the same, but now we're requesting an integer. And we'll only ever get back an integer. We won't get back an invalid integer. We won't get back an exception. It will always be an integer, and it will keep asking until they give us one. So notice how easy my code is to read now. First name, we pass this, we say request a string from this, and request a string from this. Found that maybe we can get there, and maybe those people are going to use our application. Put it to 125, 130, that's fine. Just make sure you cap it somewhere. So we could modify this, but it doesn't seem like that's the right way of going, because now we have to say, well, let's modify this, but sometimes we might not want to have an upper and lower. Sometimes we want to say, just give me a number. I don't care what number, give me a number. Well, what we can do is we can create an overloaded method for this. Public static int request int. And we can say this string message int lower min value, and then int max value. How about that? Now we don't want to repeat our code here. And usually what we do is we put this code into the more complex parameter set, the more full parameter set, and then we pass in default values when you call the simpler one. The problem is that passing in default values, it's going to be hard to do that right. What we probably end up doing is passing in the same min and max value and then saying, hey, if those two are the same, then ignore them. But that seems kludgy. So what we're going to do is we're going to make use of our private static int request int, and we'll say string message int min value int max value and bool use min max. Okay, so I'm not using this. It's not an extension method, although it could be. And in fact, you know what? We could probably make it an extension method. There we go. Now it matches. So it's an extension method, but it's internal. It's private. But it still overloads these two. Okay, so you still have the option of calling this internally just with an extra value, use min max value. So I am going to actually cut this from here and paste it in here. Since I didn't have a commonality here or enough information, I create a new one that has that Boolean that I want to use. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this, I'm going to cut it out from here and paste it in here. And then I'm going to change the min value to be equal to 0 and the max value to equal to 0. That way, I can have these optional parameters and not pass in a min and max value when I'm saying that use min max is false. Because it makes no sense to pass in a min and max value if I'm saying don't use it. Therefore, we don't have to pass it in if we say false, and it will default to zeros. We don't care because it's going to say false. So now we need to rework this logic in here so that if we're using the min-max value, we're checking to make sure the value is in the range. Now let's create a variable after is valid int, we do our check for if use min-max equals true, then we're going to put a value into is invalid range to say if min value, if the value, so that's the output, if output is greater than or equal to min value and output is less than or equal to max value, then is in valid range equals true, else is invalid range equals false. That's the fully spelled out version. However, if you want to, and it can be a good thing and a bad thing. It makes it sometimes a little harder to read, but if you remember that the if statement, this in parens right here, this gets evaluated to true or false. That's all if does. And if this is true, it runs this. If it's false, it runs this. Well, that means if I took what's in parens here and I copied it and said is in valid range equals that replaces all of this. Because this, what's in parens, evaluates to true or false. And if it's true, we are putting true in there. And if it's false, you're putting false in there. Well, that's kind of repeated work. We can just do this. However, this can make it a little more difficult to read before you go, it takes a second to go, oh, okay, I got it. You're using an if statements comparison here. That's what you're doing. Okay, I see. And you can kind of read like an if statement. Whereas this is explicit. It's very, very clear. I know what if statement is. If these two things are true, this is true. Else it's false. So it's up to you which one you want to use. I'll leave this commented out one here. You can swap between the two of them, but just know these two are equivalent. So I'm setting the is invalid range to either true or false based upon my evaluation. And it's important to say true or false because I want to say false if it's not in a valid range, because otherwise it will never trip this right here. And at the same time, I want to say true if it is in a valid range so that it will exit out if this is true as well. So just know those two things have to be working together. So now we have this request int method, extension method, that does all the work for me and does an evaluation if it needs to on the number. So now we can do is we can call this extension method from inside of these two and return that value. So return message dot request int message and false. Oops, Control Shift Space. I want to use, oops, not the message. Haha. Don't need to pass the message in because we already passed the message in. So I can say false to say don't use the min-max value. Therefore, it's going to say ignore these. And since I have the default values, I don't need to pass them in. But now I can make use of this same code. Up here, I can say return message dot request int. And here is we can say true for use min-max value and min value and max value. So now I have three different overloads, one of which is private because I didn't want to show that off to everybody because I have these two separate methods. They're a little more explicit. And so now I can call these up here and say request int, do Control Shift Space here, and say, well, actually I want to pass in 0 for the min and 120 for the max, and that's going to limit my range. Let's run this. So we can open this up, and we have what's your first name? Tim. What's your last name? I'm going to hit enter here. What's your last name? So I have to have some kind of value. I can say Corey. what's your age? I'm going to hit enter again. Nope, that's not valid. So if I say -1, what's your age? Well, it's actually 40. There we go. So it took all those values in. So now our application is working as intended. We've got all the values being entered in. It's making sure that they're valid values. The only thing we haven't done is pass in some type of optional message that says, here's the message to show if it doesn't work. We could add that in, maybe even as optional, and then pass that into the strings. But I think that we've already kind of illustrated that point. So by using these extension methods and also the method overloading, we're able to create this really easy to use code that, if you think about it, let's move this over. These two right here go into our class library probably. And now our code is just that simple to create a person model and to fill it in with the values we need. We can create more like this for things like Booleans and doubles and decimal and all the rest, and make our code really, really simple. Now, we could have made these into full methods and not extension methods. But then what we're doing is we're wrapping things. So instead of this for the age, what we do is we'd say, actually, it's gonna look like this: person.age equals request int. What is your age? 0, 1, 20, like so. And it's actually going to be not just request int, it's going to be console helper dot request int, like so. Notice you can still call it that way. But that is a little more wordy. And when you read it, it reads console helper dot request int and some parameters. This way, you have a message and you say dot request int. It's a little clearer. So it's also a little bit less coding. The balance is up to you. It's up to you to determine which way you want to go. But extension methods do give you that option of making things a little more clear when it comes to writing things out. Now, naming is really important here. I'm not terribly thrilled yet with request int. I mean, it's clear that's what you're doing. You're requesting an int. Code that makes you faster and more efficient. Don't keep writing code over and over again. Try and figure out how to write it once and reuse it even multiple times in multiple projects. And the way you use that is through class libraries. And we'll get into more of using those class libraries in the future, but you can take that class library, the DLL that it creates, and you can actually put it into other projects as well. Okay? So definitely make your life easier by how you use the tools. Your homework. So recreate the project we did for this lesson, but without looking back over what I did. So create your own and then tweak it slightly as well. Maybe ask for how much money they have in their bank account, or what was the last thing you bought and how much money was it? So you have that decimal that you're asking for. Or maybe ask for some type of double and then capture that as well and use those methods in a similar way. But of course you have to create it for double and for decimal. Maybe a Boolean, so true and false. And maybe they give you a Y or a yes, or an N and a no, and you convert that to true and false. Whatever the case may be, kind of recreate what we did, but with a few more properties, a few different types, and make sure that you can kind of grasp the concept and start thinking through how can I make my life better, faster, more efficient with the code that I write. All right. Once you're done that, then come on back for the next lesson.